hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid. Yeah. The hybrid.
Oh, you have friends?
I like to think so.
All right, well, that's good. Hey, man.
What's up?
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
All right, well, hey, everybody. Welcome to The Hybrid. It's a podcast that we're hoping allows pop culture to meet cannabis policy, and where we want to dive headfirst into the wild, fascinating world of cannabis. I'm Shawn Collins. I'll be one of your hosts, and I spent a couple of years as the executive director of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission, where we navigated the ins and outs of cannabis policy and everything from legalization debates to figuring out how many retail stores can fit on a certain street without causing a traffic jam. And joining me on this ride is my co-host, Erik Gundersen, who ran the show in Maine as the director of Maine's Office of Cannabis Policy. So between us, we've got stories and insights, and we think a shared mission, which is to make sense of this ever-evolving landscape and try to connect it to the culture that we all see around us every day. So why the hybrid? Well, cannabis isn't just a plant or a policy issue. It's sort of a phenomenon. It's in the music that you stream and listen to. It's in the movies that you watch. It's in your Instagram feed, where you might see some folks trying to sell you gummies or beverages or everything else, or new rappers that are launching their own strains. Here's the thing, though. None of that happens in a vacuum. Behind every pre-roll, behind every dispensary, every celebrity endorsement, there's this web of policies, some of them brilliant and some a little more baffling. It all shapes how this whole entire world and industry plays out, and that's where we think we can come in. So this podcast is really about pulling back the curtain. We're here to break down the dense, jargon-filled policy debates and try to tie them to the stuff that you actually care about. Your favorite shows, your local scene, or your everyday life. I've sat through plenty of hearings to know that policy can feel a bit boring if you're not in the room. And trust me, it's anything but boring when you see how it all ripples out into the real world. And Erik and I have both been there. We've drafted the rules. We've had those debates with lawmakers, and we've heard from people whose lives have changed because of this plant. And now we're trying to bring you a front row seat to that. So in this first episode, we're going to try to kick things off by telling you why we started this thing and what you can expect from us going forward. So just picture it. We're going to have conversations with the people that are shaping cannabis policy today. Policymakers, some cultural figures, industry trailblazers. And we're going to try to mix it in with some deep dives into the latest developments from new state laws and federal curveballs. And we'll explore questions like, what is a weed-infused food truck? How did that happen? Or why does your favorite strain cost twice as much in one state versus another? And yeah, we'll have some fun along the way. Maybe talk about some trivia stuff or debate the best stoner movie of all time. The idea is pretty simple. Cannabis policy doesn't have to be dry. It doesn't have to be this distant thing locked in government buildings. It's sort of alive. It's in your headphones, it's on your TV, and it might even be in your fridge. The hybrid is here to bridge that gap, blending the wonky with the witty, the serious with the surprising. So whether you're a policy nerd, a pop culture junkie, or just someone who's curious about what might be next for cannabis, we hope that the hybrid is the right place for you. So stick around. Over the next hour or so, Erik and I are going to lay out why we're doing this, what you can expect, and why it matters more than you might think. And if you like what you hear, just hit the subscribe button, follow us online, and we'll even let you join the conversation. So here we go. Erik, hey, man. Welcome to the hybrid.
Yeah, thanks. Impressive work by Chat GPT on that intro.
Thanks, man.
Phenomenal work. Very well thought out and put together. Man, I hope we can keep it high level and fun, because it certainly wasn't boring, but it wasn't necessarily the policy that wasn't boring. It was the the legislature that kept things interesting. I'm sure you've gone down a similar pathway that I did with my legislature.
No comment.
Yeah. We'll have time for those conversations about how we came to the end of our careers with the state and cannabis. But yeah, hopefully keep it high level, keep it interesting. Thanks for making this happen, Shawn, even though I'm pretty sure it was my idea to begin with, but that's all right.
Okay. Hey, we can reinvent history if you want, but yeah, look, I think the goal of this, we already sort of talked about it, is like, I've always loved policy. Don't get me wrong. Like, I love everything about, I'm sort of the nerdy policy guy that geeks out on a regulatory process and public comment. But I think what really draws me to it is how things practically apply to just sort of like seeing like the vision become reality of like walking into a retail store and knowing why windows might be frosted, or why there's sort of security cameras everywhere, and why inventory isn't necessarily available for you to like grab and smell. And like, then I think about, well, maybe it should be. And having the ability to sort of influence just the nuts and bolts of that, I think is really where like how the policy becomes reality, gets implemented, and sort of the puzzle pieces that fit together to make that happen, I think is ultimately what draws me to it. But at the same time, I can appreciate that you and I were charged with roles that actually had to imagine that stuff. And so from the everyday consumer standpoint, like I always sort of start with a question of like, do I care? Like, should I care? And if the answer is like, yes, then let's talk about it. Let's figure out sort of why things are the way they are. And then if something just feels like, it's kind of dumb, or maybe that's clunky or cumbersome, let's do something about it too. And I think the goal of this is to really breathe some life into those decisions that got made, and also maybe try to breathe some life into what's coming down the road too, which is maybe a decent segue to, well, we'll talk about like things like social consumption and what's next on the frontier of cannabis. But I briefly mentioned that I was the executive director of Massachusetts, and you ran the same role in Maine. I think you and I got to know each other really well in that capacity. Like, we became friends because of the sort of the shared work that we were doing, and some might call it shared misery that we went through at times. But, I think I really came to appreciate and respect the role you had versus the role I had, and enjoyed that collaboration that we had together. So, for those of you that don't know us, maybe the first place we should start is, who the hell is Erik Gundersen, and why is he on my screen? Why is he in my headphones right now?
Yeah, I think a little background would be good. I mean, I'm assuming our first two listeners will be our parents. They'll know our backgrounds and our names, but on the off chance somebody else is listening, I think it would be a little bit helpful. So,
my wife just knows you as Gundy. So,
well, most people just know me as Gundy, but in this world, here we go. So a little bit of background. Shawn did a nice job teeing it up. Was the the original executive director of Maine's Office of Cannabis Policy. So, like Shawn, I was in the policy world even before cannabis. I was working in the legislature as a policy advisor to actually two Maine speakers. And back in 2016, much like Massachusetts, Maine went ahead and legalized via ballot initiative. In my capacity as a policy advisor, I think it was like the day after the election, my boss and dear friend asked me to actually take a look at that underlying language that was passed by voters. And it didn't take me all but like 3 pages in to realize that we were sitting on like a dumpster fire, for lack of a better term.
I've heard the program referred to as that. Yeah, that's a mix. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Easy, Mr. Glasshouses. Yeah. No, seriously though. I mean, it was typical for what you see of industry is the one that ends up writing what the language is gonna be. So, we ended up putting together a joint select committee in the legislature, which is unique and really an awesome approach. If people don't understand how legislatures work, there's like numerous committees, but they have jurisdictions on all different types of policy areas, right? And you don't really have a lot of time to do deep dives into each individual legislative proposal, whatever it may be. So we put together this joint select committee of 17 members, that spent a year and a half together, focused solely on legalization, rewriting Maine's Legalization Act. And I was the policy liaison to the speaker on that committee. Spent a year and a half doing that work. That's really where I cut my teeth on cannabis policy. Found it fascinating. Obviously, when something's brand new, it's fascinating for people that were in the roles we were in. And then just fast forward to the end of 2018, we had a change in administration, new incoming governor. From my time in the legislature and in state party politics, I was very friendly with that group and really just gave them an understanding of all the work that needed to be done. The last administration hadn't done anything with it, and gave them just briefings on where we are and what needs to be accomplished. And at the end of the day, our governor basically asked if I would be interested in taking on the role of executive director, establishing the cannabis office, putting together the first set of rules, launching the adult use cannabis program, and spent 4 great years in that role. Got the first set of regulations done, launched the industry in 2020 amidst a global public health pandemic, which maybe there's stories we can get to there. But did that for 4 years. Had ups and downs, which I'm sure we'll get to in the conversations. Was a great job, fun job, certainly not an easy job. But since then, much like Shawn as well, over the last 2.5 years, been doing my own thing in the consulting world, mainly with state governments, just kind of lending them my experience, my expertise, my crystal ball. Because even though I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot on the podcast, like implementing a cannabis program today is a hell of a lot more difficult and complicated than it was back when we did it. But I'd like to think I can be helpful in that regard. So just been hanging out, doing my thing.
Just hanging out. Yeah. Just
hanging
small
out.
feet. Yeah. I think, similarly, and it's amazing how similar or eerie, in fact, how similar the paths are. But like you, I come from that sort of political policy intersection of, I worked in the state Senate for a bunch of years doing healthcare policy. And I thought at that point, like healthcare reform in Massachusetts, for those of you not familiar, it's like Romney Care was the precursor to Obamacare, is the precursor to the ACA that you see today. And, at the time, I'm like, this can't get any more like intense or complex. And then it was like, shut up. Like, here's cannabis policy. Like, take a spoonful of this. And it's amazing to me. So I left the Senate in 2014, I want to say. Small world. My boss at the time actually lost re-election to my college roommate. And we don't need to talk about that anymore. I think you know what you need to know. I then went to work for the state treasurer, and the ballot question in 2016, like you said, it put the authority of cannabis oversight within the state treasurer's office simply because that's where alcohol regulations reside. But it didn't give it to the alcohol regulators. It created a whole new agency alongside of it. And so it's not like as the treasurer's policy director, I could say, like, here, alcohol guys, like, this is your problem, like, figure it out. Instead, it was like, all right, tell me everything you guys do to regulate alcohol, because the theory and the goal is to regulate alcohol or regulate cannabis like alcohol. And the more I started to probe the cannabis topic, it's like, there's no way in hell you can regulate cannabis like alcohol. But I was joking at the time, like, I'm the guy that gets to Google weed at work. Cool. And then I started to like peel the layers of cannabis policy back, and I was like, oh, wait a minute. This is like really fascinating. Like, this is agricultural policy. This is social justice. This is food safety and food prep and like supply chain logistics. And like, this is really sort of like dense stuff, but it's also really interesting, like the federal interplay and the state laws and local rule, home rule petitions. And the whole thing for me was like, there's a little bit of like an adrenaline rush, because I'm thinking again, like, my world is healthcare policy, and I thought that was like intense. That was like AAA. Like, that was sort of like my warm up to cannabis policy. So our legislature too took a bit of a bite at changing the rules and sort of changing the structure. In particular, created an independent agency, appointed 5 commissioners that come from the governor's office, the treasurer's office, our attorney general's office, and then 2 more that come from all 3 of those constitutional officers. And then they posted a position for executive director, and I applied for it and was fortunate enough to be selected and chosen. And then the rest is like a blur, to be honest, because like you said, it's like the intensity of like building out an agency from scratch and building a bureaucracy alongside a regulatory scheme from scratch. You blink and 6 years later, it's like, what just happened? And behind that experience is an industry now. And, I think Maine's industry, like Massachusetts industry, is still emerging in some ways, but it's hit like a new phase too of those sort of growing pains of what is market saturation, what is market consolidation. And obviously those are things we want to talk about as this podcast develops as well. But I think from that experience standpoint, a lot of our government background probably prepared us really well for like which levers to pull to get something done inside of bureaucracy. But also like the political background, I think, helped us navigate the
I think
cannabis is thorny.
The political backgrounds, I don't know. So you had been in state government. I had never been in state government. I went from working 10 years in the legislature to working in state government. And I showed up.
Realize the legislature is state government, right?
Well, it's different in bureaucracy versus the legislature. It is vastly different. And I had no idea how anything got done. It was a steep learning curve for me. When you're talking about putting together agency budgets, FTEs, procurement, like who to call when you need what, all the support and different agents. Oh my God. Luckily I had team members that I brought in very quickly that had that background. That was helpful, but I had a rude awakening when I transitioned from the legislature into this agency of one.
Yeah.
So
I had 3 years of state treasurer's office, but my job for the treasurer was ultimately essentially like her government liaison. So I was sort of like lobbyist for the treasurer back to the legislature. So I had a department, it was a couple of employees, but nowhere near the bureaucracy of procurements. And I think behind the scenes too is like you're building an agency, like the things you take for granted too. And you had this problem or sort of this challenge as well, which was like, I didn't have an HR department. I didn't have a legal department, but I also had, and this is where I think our timelines are merging at some point, is like my 2018 was spent implementing a series of regulations, but also building a legal department and building an IT department and building an investigations and enforcement department. And so it was like, I always used to joke, and my communication staff used to hate me or like sort of, roll their eyes and be like, it's like building the fire truck on the way to the fire. It's building the airplane in midair. Like there's so many analogies that, they're appropriate, but they get sort of old after a while. But I think my takeaway is like, it was so intense, the rollout, the public pressure and the expectations around, why are stores not open? Like why, what the hell is taking so long? And I like, at my core, I understood that. And like, I felt that motivation to just open stores. But then I also thought to myself, look, if we open stores and we fall flat on our face, like that's the story. That's our reputation, signed, sealed, it's over, like call it in. If on the alternative, like, so there was this public expectation, we're going to open stores by July 1st. And nowhere in the law did it say July 1st. The ballot question had this sort of July 1st milestone that if you didn't open stores or approve licenses by July 1st, all of your med folks could just convert. And so I should note that our medical program obviously predated our adult use program. And so at first I was solely responsible for adult use, but then the statute also required me to migrate our medical program under our jurisdiction as well. So again, like not like you have enough to do, by the way, take over another bureaucracy and just integrate it into your agency. So I think that public pressure was like, we all sweat those details, but then you're also like, the main pressure you have is like, by the way, you're responsible for public health, safety, and welfare. And like, that's your core function. Don't screw that up. And I know, I'm sure you deal with this with your clients today. Like that's the function. That's your licensing agency. You've got to protect and promote public health. You've got to protect and promote public safety. But also like make this intoxicating substance more readily available.
Well, I mean, that's like, yeah, I do see that in other states with some of my state clients, all of my state clients.
Yeah.
The expectations around this stuff are insane. I don't know why with cannabis, everything needs to happen yesterday. But I can go back to, I remember, I think our agency was only a few months old when we had our very first legislative hearing around some proposal to change the program, even before we were done the first set of rules. And I remember having a discussion around that, why it was a bad idea. And the first question I got was a state representative from Southern Maine, I won't name names, that started shouting, why hasn't the market launched? Where are the stores? Why hasn't the market launched? And I just wanted to be like, granted, I'm only a few months into this role, so maybe my reaction would have been different 4 years in, but I wanted to be like, are you kidding me? Like, of course, the APA, like procedures you need to go through to draft rules. You understand how long it takes to get some well thought out rules on paper, about 90 pages. You understand how long it takes to like build out a state agency. You understand that we need to have hundreds of conversations with all these different stakeholder groups to make sure that we don't step in it somewhere. You understand how complicated it is to get procurements for new systems. You understand how difficult it is to like implement a new licensing system, a new tracking system, new case management. Like the expectations around how quickly this stuff happens is insane a lot of the times. Yeah, it should happen quickly. There are benefits to getting licenses out the door and a market established quickly. But to your point, Shawn, like they're under such scrutiny and such a microscope. If you make a misstep, it could be a catastrophe. God, I don't know where that comes from. It's ridiculous.
Well, you might remember this because I think in that race against the clock, we rolled out retail sales in November of 2018. It was like Black Friday of 2018. And the biggest complaint at the time, and I remember saying like, all right, here we go. Like it's out of our hands now, right? Like flip the switch, off it goes. We had our tracking in place. We had inventory set. We could see it all. Everything was tested. We could prove those tests or sort of confirm those tests were conducted. And so basically I described at the time, like we have a fully regulated supply chain and system, like go, green flag, off to the races. And the biggest complaint out of the first day was traffic. And I thought about, I'm listening to that. I'm like, no shit. Like, of course there's traffic. One, it's Black Friday. People are home. And like, I think one of the towns that had the first, one of our first stores also opened like a super Walmart on the same day. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like we gave cities and towns like days notice, like it's going to, so you couldn't just like, you get our signature and like you open tomorrow. You had to give them sort of advance notice so they could make preparations, accommodations. But I'm also thinking, these are the first legal cannabis sales in the adult use market east of the Mississippi. There's going to be traffic. Like the parking lot might fill up. There's a good chance of that.
Yeah.
The other concern I had in the background was like, is there enough inventory? Do these stores have enough like inventory because that would be embarrassing. Again, not my problem per se as the regulator. Like, am I really worried about our stores conducting sufficient sales? I mean, I'm thinking about it, but I'm not like, it's not up to me. I'm not growing the plants. I'm not managing the inventory, but all of those things, all those preparations that went into it, I'm thinking, if traffic is your biggest problem, then I'm going to declare victory. Like that's success.
I remember reading about that launch too. Obviously, I had interest in it
Sure.
in my capacity where we were a few months behind you. I got to give you some credit where credit's due because we took that into account when we did our launch, where we coordinated with local PDs, we coordinated with local governments, we coordinated with our licensees. We had requirements for them to have on-site security and fencing. And keep in mind too, like we were in COVID, so we have like these ridiculous pictures of like these quarter-line miles with fencing, everybody 6 feet apart with masks on. So yeah, we did a hell of a lot more due diligence and preparation because of Massachusetts. So thanks for that traffic show.
Yeah, we took the hit for you.
To your point, our headlines I think we launched with like 6 or 7 stores, what I called like a minimally viable marketplace. Was, there's not enough diversity in products on the shelves. And it's just like, do you guys like understand how this works? Like,
Yeah, right.
we're not launching a market that's like 2 years in. This is day one where we have like 4 cultivators, 2 manufacturers, 6 retailers. Do you not want me to launch the market? Because a lot of people are gonna have a problem with that. Our operators included, but it's just
That's the thing. Is
insane.
like there's no win. There's no win there.
There's never any win.
But I think the point is, think about the SKUs that are in the market today, though. Like the amount of volume of like product variety, and I think the thing too is like consumers now have ample choice, which is great. I think that's what you want in a marketplace. But then consumers are also going to make their choices, and they're going to choose things based on really only a handful of things, right? Like availability, certainly one. Price is probably the most predominant. Quality, consistency and quality. But like at some point, there can't be like how many different gummy varieties are going to be on the market? How many vape cartridges and all the different varieties of vape hardware? Like, by all means, like introduce that stuff to the market, but then don't look at your regulator and wonder like, my product isn't selling. It must be your fault, or it must be like you're the one accountable. It's like, or consumers just don't choose your product, and that's okay, because like, how awesome is it that we actually have a choice to make now when we walk into a dispensary? And so I think that's the thing too, is like the level of accountability we always felt as regulators for things that were way beyond our control, is because I think the other thing too is like, once you license somebody, like you start to sort of know these people too. Like what's nice about, I think, the Maine market and some elements of the Massachusetts market is there is a degree of like of local entrepreneurship that's going on in this industry, which is, again, there aren't these like, there's some big companies by all means, but there's not these like major conglomerates that are like nameless, faceless, offshore, like, major corporations. It's sort of like, these are people you get to know, and these are local brands. And so you're kind of rooting for them in a way, but you're also, I used to say, like, we're umpires. Our job is to call balls and strikes. That's our job. At the same time, there's some people when they step to the plate that you're like, I hope they hit this out of the park. Like, I wish them well. But if they strike out, I got to call it. Like, plain and simple. And so that's a delicate balance sometimes. I think it puts a lot of pressure on, and by no means did you and I do anything alone. Like, we were fortunate to have a really great team and really talented staff. We were able to recruit. One thing I've always held is that cannabis, as this really fascinating public policy area, is a awesome recruitment tool, because people actually wanted to work on this issue. And so that was
interview, that would always be their answer. Like, why you apply for, why you want this job? Oh, the novelty of it. It's so cool. It's so cool. And it's funny too, even doing interviews in like year 4, they would say that same thing. And I'd be like, where have you been? Like,
yeah, exactly.
I'm worn down. This is not new.
But be careful of the one that's like, why do you want this job? It's like, oh, I love weed. And I'm like, all right, let's talk about that for a second then. Yeah. It's like, what do we love about weed? Because that's the thing too, is like, we don't sell it here at the Cannabis Control Commission. We actually regulate it. We don't get samples. We don't get, but I think I was always drawn to the fact that like building a startup within state government is really an exciting, riveting, intense, like I said, effort. And so really to be able to recruit people that knew that, expected that, and sort of dug into it alongside you, was really rewarding. But the work was also like, there was a lot of work. There's a lot, like you said, technology, the SOPs that you've got to put together, and then also trying to fit it into an infrastructure and sort of an architecture that is not known for being nimble, is not known for being like, it's not that there's not a sense of urgency. It's just, it's very prescriptive in process and heavy in process. So like even the rulemaking process it's if you know the system and you know the exercise, you can navigate it. But if you're in a hurry, it's molasses. Like you're not so fast. And again, there's value to that, because rules should be very intentional and they come with authority. But at the same time, if you're in a hurry, it's not your friend. So,
I mean, to your point though, yeah, it's not designed to move quickly, anything.
yeah,
I remember calling in a lot of favors, asking for asking for waivers to be able to move that stuff as quickly as possible. And luckily, I'm sure you've gone through this in your time at the commission when like there's a life cycle to this stuff. Like when you come in the first year, you're the cool kid and the cool new kid in town. You get what you ask for. But at some point there's a switch and that quickly goes downhill, which leads to a short shelf life for cannabis regulators, to be quite honest. But yeah, and it's funny. I want to go back because you brought up an interesting point about like the local feel, certainly in Maine, and I'm sure you still have it in Massachusetts, and rooting for some of your licensees. Early on, like I completely understood there were two parts of my job, right? I'm a regulator first and foremost to protect public health and safety, but also like this is a legal industry now, and I want to try my best to make the market competitive so those folks can be successful in really an environment that is not economically feasible. And I always look through it through that lens, even though I'm sure there were operators or licensees in Maine that would say I was totally anti-cannabis or anti-business. They don't always have a front row seat or the ability to peek behind the curtain and be privy to some of those conversations, but that was certainly something that I was always very tuned into, to make sure that these are legal businesses. These are neighbors. These are people in the community. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they're like all great actors. The vast majority of them were.
yeah, right.
So to your point, yeah, you want them to be successful. And that was part of your job. And that's part of what I kind of preach to new cannabis regulators. There's always such a focus on like, we need to have rules and licensing in place and it needs to be structured and we need to protect public health. Well, you also have this other responsibility on the side, or you should at least be aware of it in your day-to-day decision making. So
I think that's right. And I think that it's not hard to balance that. I think it's hard to demonstrate that balance. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Like, I think like you and I think at our core knew those sort of competing, but also just side-by-side obligations of it's our job to uphold public health, safety, welfare. That is literally the job. But then we also have sort of this social mission tacked on top of that that's just as important. And then I think that's the juggling and the balancing. At the same time, like how do you convey that externally? How do you convey that to, one, the folks, your industry that you're regulating, but also the general public that's like, well, I thought you were supposed to get all these stores open and all these stores are supposed to be locally owned. And like you have this social equity, social justice mission. Like, why are you not succeeding on that front? And I would also ask our staff and even our legislators and our regulators at the time, like, what does success look like on that front sometimes?
With my colleagues that I work with now, we talk about that all the time. Like, how do you define success?
Yeah.
And that's part of what like makes launching markets today much more difficult than when we were implementing our programs. Like, to be successful, you need to get licenses out the door, a diversity in products that are on the shelves. You need to fix all the energy problems that are wrapped up in growing cannabis indoors. You need to fix inequality in your state. You got to do all of these crazy things, which is really taking away from like with cannabis. And again, in an economic environment that is not like sustainable, like you need to get licenses out the door as quickly as possible. You need to launch your market. And then I would say, if you can do that allows access to cannabis without having a blip on the radar for like some like negative health outcomes, that should be a win.
That is a win. That is absolutely a win. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you and I in our previous roles would have been proud of that effort because we knew exactly how much work went into achieving that win. And that's one of the things I think we deprived ourselves of sometimes internally at the commission was like we didn't celebrate our victories as often as enough, as certainly not as often as we sort of took the hit or blamed ourselves for even the simplest or sort of the most minor of mistakes. And that's human nature, I think, to some extent too, but it's almost exacerbated in our roles where, like one bad news story or cycle is like so deflating, so defeating. Meanwhile, it's like every day that you wake up and like stores open and like people can access adult use cannabis. And now I think I mentioned earlier, we were also charged with migrating our medical program over. You mentioned like the public health emergency during COVID. Sort of a quick aside, like our governor declared adult use to be non-essential, closed everything.
I remember that. That is shitty.
It was like, there's a story, and I'd actually love to see if she'll come on at some point. There's one business in particular, the day before that happened, I signed her commence operations. She was a product manufacturer. And I remember calling her so excited, like, congratulations, you made it. Completely like bootstrapped entity, and she's killing it now. And her products are amazing. I could actually say that out loud now. Like the quality's there, like she's doing such a remarkable job. But I remember saying like, congratulations, you made it. And then the next day it's like another phone call I got to make, like, so you actually can't sell into the market because there's no market to sell into. It's been declared non-essential. And the other thing that happened though was medical was allowed to stay open. And so all of our dispensaries, the vertical integrated dispensaries, co-located dispensaries could stay open, but the supply chain had to be medical. And so only patients could access cannabis. And the logic is that if it's easy enough for people to become medical patients in your state, it's going to explode. And sure enough, we went from like 60,000 patients to 100,000 patients in a matter of a single month. And I remember thinking at the time, and these are like happy accidents that thank God they happened. For a long time prior to some technical changes we made, we were processing individually, like staff-based processing applications for medical, where there was like a backlog of like months of people just our staff going through medical applications to process your medical registration. We made it more of a technological back-end enhancement. And you mentioned, joked earlier about the embracing of artificial intelligence. This was basically looking at like, why are we in processing some of these applications? Like, what takes so long? And it was verifying someone's picture. Like, do they use their driver's license? Do they use a passport photo? Okay, like literally looking at me like, yep, that confirms, click. And then oftentimes it was applying a fee waiver. We used to charge a fee to register with the medical program. But people would submit like a Mass Health or Medicare statement as like, I can't afford to pay the fee, so we would waive that fee. I would say 75 to 80% of our applications included waivers, and we had to manually go in and be like, "Yep, you're eligible." Click. Those 2 clicks that was literally the human interaction, and then off it goes. So we thought, can I automate this? Can I reconcile our data with the RMV on the back end where if you use your driver's license, we just pull that photo in and off it goes. And then the commission, my bosses, the policymakers, said, let's just waive the $50 fee. Why charge it in the first place? We don't keep it. It goes into state coffers, sure, but just waive the fee. By those 2 changes, we automated, I think it was like 95% of all of our applications, just like the month before COVID. So we solved the problem right before the tidal wave. If we didn't, that would have totally crushed us. But the point here is that market shift. Like, here I am thinking like I'm rooting for these businesses to succeed. And then I like inadvertently, or, I think intentionally in some instances, like these other pressure points, like, we're dealt a crisis. How do you react to it? And it's like, again, the impact on your staff, the impact on your industry, we sweat those details. And I think our ability to process all those applications without even like a glitch, massive win, huge win. But instead I'm like, oh, adult use is not essential. Like, what a defeat. Completely gloss over the fact that like we just withstood, exponential growth in our medical program. And again, without a glitch. But yeah, no, let's not celebrate that win. Let's instead pivot to the crisis du jour. So,
fun story. I've shared this with you before, Shawn, but details that we didn't sweat out at the Office of Cannabis Policy in Maine was the universal symbol.
Yeah.
You know the story, right? So to give people like a sneak peek of how the sausage is made sometimes within a state agency. So much like every state, every new program needs to come up with a universal symbol to identify cannabis, and cannabis products indeed have cannabis in them, right? So one of the first things we did after we got the rules was we said, well, we need to quickly put together a universal symbol. This can't be that hard, right? So did a quick Google search. I think there were at this point, 7 other universal symbols, and there was
give or
nothing. There are nothing universal about them.
Yeah.
They're all different. I was like, this is the silliest thing ever. I'm not gonna spend money for some outside vendor, somebody else in state government to develop this little icon for me. I don't know if this is the first time I ever talked to you or emailed you. It might have been, but I remember like, hey, I'm Erik. Nice to meet you. Hey, can we share your universal symbol? That was it. That was it. You were nice enough. I'm sure you ran it by your legal counsel, but it's funny too, because if you're like, yeah,
Maybe.
exactly. Maybe not. Because I'm pretty sure, like, would I be right in saying if you Googled, however, like to the 24 different universal symbols, there's 23 of them now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
I remember I took a little bit of like a celebration lap internally to say, because one of the things that's sort of tongue in cheek, but it's true, is like, there's nothing universal about our universal symbols. But the source of pride internally for us was like, because I sort of diagnosed that frustration of like, why the hell do we call this universal symbol? So then your phone call, your inquiry was like, wait a second, like if there ever is a universal symbol, there is now momentum for the origins to be Massachusetts universal symbol.
Yeah.
And so the personal pride we took internally was like, okay. And also I thought to myself, our status as like neighboring states made a lot of logical sense, right? Like, and so my thought was, if our law enforcement see this universal symbol, it should be a signal to them that this is at some point, this was a legal cannabis product. But also it's a warning symbol too. And so if that symbol becomes more readily accessible, available, identifiable, a lot of logic behind having that embraced and more consistent. And yeah, so I think it's sort of a behind the scenes story of like how the sausage gets made. And again, I think the simplicity of it is really nice.
Well, that's exactly what it was. It was like, I have too much shit to be doing. I'm just going to call Shawn. See
if I told you the scramble behind the scenes of how those symbols actually came to be, it was like an oh shit moment of, we've got to have regs done, and our regs call for, not to mention our regs, but our statute calls for a universal symbol. We don't have one yet. And it was like, I actually had this really interesting idea of like crowdsourcing our universal symbols and like soliciting like artists to come up with them. And then it was like, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll get to that the next time we legalize something, because like we're doing like fast and furious to get this thing done.
Yes, that's not happening right now.
But it was like, that's a really cool idea. We should do that. And then, yeah, okay. Can they do it by tomorrow? Because that's when the regs need to be printed and on the register and then ultimately promulgated. And so it was like a quick call to our graphic designer to be like, can I do a change order? I need to like quick and dirty universal symbol. I remember I Googled the existing ones and was like, make them look like this, but don't copy them.
Yeah.
And that's where it occurred to me of like, but what's universal about that?
Give me a nice triangle, nice little pot leaf.
I need an exclamation point. Yeah.
Flair. Yeah.
And I totally predicted, and of course it came true. I'm like, we don't allow the industry to use the leaf on any labeling or packaging or any branding, but here we go. We're going to slap the leaf on every single product. But again, it's like, it's a universal symbol. And I remember also we had, we put them in our regulations, and I was sort of like paranoid about like, well, what if someone steals them right off our regulations and puts them on illicit market products? Like, we can't throw a watermark on it. Like, don't allow people to use it. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. If illicit market products want to warn people that it's cannabis and that it contains THC, is that a bad thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, are they stealing, or is there like actually a public good in like, should there still be a warning? And then of course it became like, well, it undermines the legal market. So I get the economic side of it, but again, balancing the public health I don't know, a lot of, that's where our minds tend to go in these like quiet moments during the fury of all the stuff that's swirling around, all the decisions that have to get made, and all the progress that has to get implemented. You also like allow yourself to contemplate like, well, what if, and how about, and so I think quick, and I want to jump into some other topics here too, but we were audited during my time at the commission, and I remember talking to our auditors that were sort of under our hood and thinking they took almost 2 years to audit our office. And what they audited was basically like a year-long time frame. And I said to them when on sort of like an exit conference when they were releasing their findings, I just want to like pause for a moment and say, you've had 2 years to second guess every decision we made during the course of our busiest year. Just so we're clear, like it took you 2 years to go through all the decisions that we made, and their findings were fine. Like I think auditors serve a valid purpose, and the findings that they made, like sure, like we didn't train everybody on like an IT thing. It's like, okay, we should have done that. Totally fine. We had some debates about testing and whether or not things could be validated or proven. It's like all this is healthy, like feedback, and like it's helpful to sort of Monday morning quarterback all these things, and we should strive to be a better agency. But let's just pause and acknowledge that you had the luxury of 2 years to basically question and second guess and judge all the decisions that were made in this flurry of activity around this agency. And like, so for me, again, like the victory lap there is like, if that's all you came up with, like, cool.
Yeah. Huge one.
Congratulations. Yeah. I think congratulations to our staff, but also again, it was not an adversarial process by any means. It was very much like, come on in, we'll share everything, like, because we want to be better. We want our program to be better. We want to be better public servants. But at the end of the day, too, it's like we also worked our ass off for a year long, making all of these very pressurized decisions. And if your feedback is that you missed the mark on these handful of things, like, again, I'm happy to declare victory on that and take that victory lap. But that's sort of a look back, right? So the 2-year audit sort of does the look back. Looking ahead, what, as you work with clients across the country, and I should note too, your work is predominantly with state governments and entities that are sort of working within and supporting state governments, and really on that sort of public side. My work is sort of all over the place. It's, I think of myself as sort of a problem solver, much like you, and like throw me at a problem and I can sort of try and tackle it for you. But I work with industry folks pretty regularly. I try to help them navigate the regulatory scheme. And, as you deal with your clients, though, like what's on the horizon? What are they stewing on now? And, where do you find your work headed maybe over the next, I don't know, 6 months, year? Like what's on the radar? I think obviously social consumption comes to mind. But maybe we talk about that for a minute as far as what you see and how folks are tackling that issue.
I'd say a few things. Social consumption is one. On-site consumption, hemp, which I'm sure we'll spend multiple episodes talking about. And it's all tied back into when I keep saying, like, it's harder to launch a market today than it was 8 years ago because of all these different variables that are in play now. But certainly there's a lot of conversation in New England. There's a lot of conversation there's a conversation everywhere about on-site consumption, which is something that there are a lot of things that I thank my lucky stars about that I didn't have to deal with at my time with the Office of Cannabis Policy. And this is certainly one of them. Like we had a 1.5-year conversation around like off-site sales, let alone on-site consumption. And it's just such a messy policy area to try to get it right. It can be very difficult. And when we say that, and we've said it a lot of times, but I think I should probably, or one of us should come out and say it, like probably the most fun part of the job, but equally probably the most frustrating is the vast number of stakeholders that you're playing games of chess with and having conversations with and soliciting feedback. You're talking about your industry operators, municipal officials, the legislature, public health, public safety, parents. Like there are so many, and especially something when you're talking about on-site consumption, you're having conversations or I'm sure we'll talk about it. You should be having conversations with all of those groups because they all have valid positions on it. And you need to take into consideration those positions. But at the end of the day, much like almost everything in cannabis, there's going to be a decision made that's in opposition with somebody's position on whatever it may be, which doesn't make it the wrong decision. And I had to tell myself that 1,000 times when I was in the position. When you are forced to make the decision, look, just because this group is unhappy doesn't mean it's not the right decision. Anyway, that's beside the point. But I think social consumption is such an interesting topic because, I mean, why is it happening now? In a lot of states, it just makes sense. Just the evolution of the market. It's kind of like, all right, this makes sense that this is what's next. Some are coming out of the gates with it, which I think is a huge mistake for a number of different reasons. We've already talked about how should we be determining success. Any ancillary noise that could like interrupt that, I think is a mistake. What should we be considering? Like those positions from the different stakeholder groups, what should be the priority? What are we focusing on? Can we actually do it and make an economically viable license?
Right.
Like, I don't know.
No, I think that's, I don't know I think is the only answer that's really, I shouldn't say honest, but like, I mean, nobody knows is the honest answer. I think states have tried. I think the models vary, and they vary with variations of success. But I think, to your point about consumption sort of being the next phase, I wrote about this on a sort of an essay, article, blog sort of thing.
I missed that.
Around, it was basically, thanks for reading it, by the way. I also did a quick little podcast on it too. I'm sure you didn't like or subscribe to that one either, but your clients probably have. So anyway, really around like the thinking about our cannabis, again, this is like alcohol versus or as compared to cannabis. Our cannabis market today is basically liquor stores and package stores. There's no bar equivalent yet. There's no social aspect yet. But cannabis as a plant and as a culture is incredibly social. And so its access point is sort of counterintuitive to how people have traditionally, historically embraced and used cannabis. What I think is really interesting about the times today, though, is the product variety and how, there's a booming beverage market in cannabis and hemp for that matter. And we should probably talk about sort of the distinctions between them because there's not a lot, but there's some that I think are really outliers, especially around sort of the advertising and the ability to cross state lines and sell to different consumers. But by and large, it's someone once said to me, and I've used it and stolen it and sort of co-opted it, is that like hemp and cannabis is a legal distinction, not a botanical distinction. And I think that it's really apt to sort of help people imagine what is hemp, what is cannabis. There's not a hell of a lot of difference outside of their legal status. But I think the fact of you can introduce a social consumption market with a beverage industry alongside it is that probably wasn't the case 5-6 years ago. Beverages were sort of a concept. Now they're a proven commodity that can be scaled. And I think there's a lot of big players too, sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see what happens, using the Farm Bill. And so I think that's an interesting development that wasn't in existence. I think there's still a public health concern around combustion in particular. And that also, I think, equates to vaping too. And then, of course, like you said, it's sort of we understand impairment when it comes to alcohol. We understand the liability around impairment when it comes to alcohol, but we don't necessarily know it when it comes to cannabis. And how do you train a bud tender to look for signs of impairment, knowing that different products have earlier versus later onsets and sort of the human physiology is different as far as, it's fat soluble. So, 5 milligrams to me versus 5 milligrams to you is like all these things are like, so you think about social consumption should be easy. Just do it. Okay. Now what? Like you've got all these things you've got to juggle as a regulator. And again, I know you're navigating that with clients, and I am as well, but it's just none of this stuff is nothing simple. So
no, nothing simple. And it's funny too, because like I think it's a great idea, right? As long as it's well thought out for nothing more than even just like personal freedoms. Like it's legal products. Let's figure out a safe way to do it. but two things. I find it funny too, because when you're talking about the intoxicating piece, well, the intoxicating piece, obviously it's intoxicating, but when you're talking about the driving high,
Yeah, right.
and people are like, well, there's bars everywhere. People are allowed to go to bars and they drive home all the time. Why can't you do that with cannabis? I think somebody needs to point out, like, that's a disaster. I think in general, alcohol and the negative health outcomes from alcohol is not great. So just pointing to that and being like, hey, we should be able to do it because those folks over there can, I think is not a great starting point. I think the more important part of the conversation when you're talking about like what different models can we do this, I think it's clear for our parents that are listening, when you're talking about what model should we follow. I think traditionally most people are thinking about like, you walk into like a retailer in a section or a different room, there's couches and you sit there and then you smoke and you leave.
Yeah.
Like that's where I talk about like, who's going to do that? That's not going to make a business money, right? I can't imagine it would. But when you start talking about like cannabis being supplementing some other activity you can go out and do, is where it starts to make sense and where I think the conversation needs to start around on-site consumption. And I've heard other people say this. This is not like a unique idea that I've ever had, but it's the more you talk about it, the more it makes total sense. Like you go to dinner to have a meal and you have a beer. You go to dinner, you have a meal and maybe a joint. Or you go bowling and you have a beer. You go bowling, maybe you can have a joint. How do you make that model work? Because I think at the end of the day, that's where it's going. The accessibility and the personal freedoms is there. And you can actually do it in a way where people aren't losing businesses or losing money, I guess.
But I think that's the cannabis in addition to something. And this is, again, it sounds like you might have actually read my piece. Because that's one of the things I tried to drive home was I think the economics work better if cannabis is not your profit leader, if cannabis is a supplemental income to something that's also existing. So, a lot of people like to pair yoga and cannabis, but I think you're right. The other part on the social side of it is sort of the from a cultural standpoint, how welcoming cannabis could be to folks that don't partake, right? So if I don't drink, I can still go to a bar socially with my friends and enjoy myself and not feel weird or like an outlier. But if it's just a, cannabis lounge tied to retail, and I go buy a pre-roll and enjoy it there and then off I go, I'll meet you wherever we're going next. Right. So there's nothing there for me. But if it is a movie festival or a music festival, and this is where I think cannabis and culture really are so intermingled, and especially when you start to think about the different product varieties as well, if I can go and start like go to a movie theater and say like, I'm going to drop tincture or I'm going to have a gummy and then start the festival. Like I'm buying a movie ticket first and foremost. And then secondary to that, I'm buying something to enhance that experience. Or if I go to a social environment where I'm going to a bar, I mean, think about the boom of mocktails. The margins are like stupid crazy on mocktails because it's basically like soda water and fruit. And you're selling it for the same price as a cocktail. That to me tells me that one, there's a consumer demand for an alternative to alcohol. But then secondly, that tells me that people are willing to try new things. And also that there is something social and acceptable about, I want to participate, I want to feel like I'm participating, but I don't want the alcohol tied to it. And so if cannabis is that alternative as well, and it could be also low dose. And I think it sort of segues into Minnesota, I think, hit on something with this brewery and sort of beverage market where you've got the traditional infrastructure of a brewery. You have, and what I mean by infrastructure is like equipment, the sort of the technology, the canning ability, that sort of thing. But also you've got the ready-made social atmosphere of a brewery where like my wife and I love to go to breweries. We can bring the dog, we can bring the baby, like we can have a good time. And it's all the same, like I'm not a big beer drinker. So if there was something else there for me, it's a good chance I'd try it, because, I don't need like a 9% IPA. This is not for me. I don't really care for it. But obviously there's a good market for it. These breweries are crushing it. They're popping up everywhere. But if they could offer an alternative, because there's plenty of a marketplace that's not consuming alcohol today. And I think what's interesting about that is, again, back to the economics, is the alcohol industry, I think, is sitting on the sidelines watching to see what unfolds with cannabis, because they know that it's not a matter of cannabis cannibalizing their market. Cannabis is attracting consumers that alcohol was never going to get. And so if they can embrace those consumers and bring them into their market, I think there's a business model that succeeds there. And again, you have a lot more insight into Minnesota than I do, but I think there's a model there that's sort of a happy accident that might have scalability, or at least has a teachable element that other jurisdictions could maybe look at. And also, again, other breweries and manufacturers could look at as, does this work? Could this succeed? So not to put you on the spot, but I think Minnesota's got some decent insights.
No, and it'll be interesting to see what we learn once there's like a little research done into it. What is the impact? I mean, they have two separate cannabis programs. They have their hemp derived, which is what you're talking about, where bars and restaurants, nearly any bar and restaurant you go into in Minnesota will have hemp derived THC beverages to choose from. It's fascinating. It's interesting. They already have a cannabis program up and running. But what I would like to know is understanding who's accessing that. What are the demographics? What are the outcomes? What's driving their decision making? And looking at it through that lens, but also through the lens of a typical cannabis marketplace, and understanding if it's a good thing or if it's a bad thing, or probably, if I had to guess, what subtle tweaks need to be made.
Sure.
So, yeah, it'll be an interesting case study for sure.
But that also reminds us too, and I think you and I appreciate this, but I think it's important for folks to remember, this entire thing is an experiment. So there's going to be tweaks. There has to be tweaks. And
yeah, I mean, there's going to be tweaks forever.
But I think neither one of us are stubborn enough to like sit here and be like, oh, we nailed it out of the gate. Like everything's perfect. So like, shut up. No change is necessary. Quite the opposite. Like I think both of us would be very honest about, yeah, if I could go back and do that again, I'd probably change my mind. Or didn't quite get that one perfect, so let's try that again.
I can think of a couple.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of your program too. So the thing is, I think that example, though, I think about the Minnesota, because I'm glad you distinguished, like one's hemp-based, one is sort of a cannabis market. I'm really curious to see how they coexist as well. Where, for instance, if I can go to a brewery or I can go to a restaurant and try, say, a cannabis seltzer, I may not have otherwise gone into a dispensary and bought a cannabis seltzer, but if I tried one, enjoyed it, and thought, I might like this, now I can go to a cannabis dispensary and buy a 4-pack, buy a 6-pack. And I may not have otherwise done that, or I may not have even tried it at all. And so I think, is it an entry point, potentially, to a cannabis market, especially if it's, again, that sort of low-dose hemp-derived? Or is it alternatively, and I think this is where the economics still need to prove out, is it competition, where this hemp-derived marketplace, and I think this is a much bigger, more in-depth conversation. We should probably have it on this podcast of the sort of direct-to-consumer hemp-derived THC marketplace that can advertise on Instagram, sort of blows up your feed every time you log in. And, I love to send my buddies like Instagram reels, and every time I like scroll, I just see another advertisement for the latest, in product introduction. And we should also acknowledge, therefore, that the cannabis market cannot do that. They're not allowed to do that. And so there's an inherent sort of structural disadvantage. All the same, I wonder, like, those two markets, they're like first cousins. And to me, it's like, you're the same team. You don't want to admit it, but you are. And so the more you can come together and sort of solve some of this stuff for one another and with each other, I think it's going to help both of your markets survive in the long run. And then ultimately, again, like, coexist. But I think my gut leans me more toward entry point to cannabis versus competitor to cannabis. But that's a gut instinct. That's not
Yeah.
I can't
mean,
prove that.
you bring up a huge conversation about hemp in cannabis, or hemp and marijuana, needing to understand we're the same team and get in a room and hash some of this stuff out to address a lot of the issues that we know are happening out there around, hemp, quite frankly. I think right now, fundamentally, it is competition.
Yeah.
It's going to, what's the most interesting, and we can talk more about this in a future episode because I think it would be an interesting conversation. What I think the takeaway would be, depending on the outcomes, would this hemp-derived beverage market in Minnesota could be a model of a way to re-envision retail in cannabis. And what I mean by that is, like, accessibility, low dose versus high dose. Can there be a difference around how those are accessible to consumers? Because we're still very much, I don't know, what are we, 12 years into legalization? I'm not going to do the quick math. I'm probably wrong on that. But like, we're still very much in the four walls, brick and mortar, all things cannabis, or inside these, only cannabis. I don't think that's where we're going to be 20 years from now.
I hope not.
But this is like the first one where it's like, all right, now we have cannabis products accessible to consumers in a restaurant. Those beverages, it's not like they're like wheeling out dabs or anything, but just kind of a tiered structure, Willie, for retail, much like how a lot of states do tiered cultivations or tiered manufacturing, like tiered anything. So that's certainly what I'm interested in seeing, and how that actually drives the conversation.
And maybe there's a model. Maybe not a model, because I think there's an example in like how some states treat alcohol too. And again, I hate to keep coming back to that comparison, but I think it's just,
I hate that comparison.
It's helpful though. And so despite my hate for it, let me use it. And which is essentially like, some states you can buy beer in a gas station, but spirits are purchased in a state-owned, state-run facility. That's where I would sort of diverge. I'm not advocating for that by any means, but I think it might be that the beer is available readily. It's a low dose, sort of entry level, accessible, and I would say less, therefore harmful, less risky, versus their higher dose is available in. And I would say, the other thing we have to keep in mind as well, and it's sort of ever present, ever front of mind for me, is this is also medicine for people. And so I think to preserve that market, to me, is fully integrated into a pharmacy setting. Like, think about like ibuprofen versus higher dose sort of Percocets and Oxy, and like that's got to be prescribed through a provider, like, and managed and dosed and titrated, versus like, I have a headache, I'll take 2 ibuprofen and sort of sleep it off or rest it off. I think your point is a valid, very valid one, which is 10, 15, 20 years from now, we should not have exclusively cannabis dispensaries. That model is wildly inefficient from a supply chain standpoint, completely cost prohibitive. Or if we do, we just shouldn't, because there's so many other things that accompany cannabis as well, that it should just be, it should be available as a consumer good inside of where you get other consumer goods. And again, a package store, and by all means, like age-gated, properly labeled, with lab testing, like all the things that we have as sort of the infrastructure around public health and safety need to exist, but it should just be more consumer accessible.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, there would still be a regulatory structure around it.
Mm-hmm.
But based off of this case study in Minnesota, if we find that we can actually do this responsibly, where we don't have more negative health impacts or public safety impacts, it's a conversation that's going to have to be had by a larger group. Because certainly I've had this conversation with some of my colleagues a lot over the last, year, 2 years. So,
yeah, I would say you should probably send them what I wrote about social consumption. It's available on my website. It's available on my website. Yeah, it'll trust me, it'll be emblazoned all over this podcast. Tell your friends, look it up, tell your friends. But I think that's where a lot of this stuff, it's easy for me to say now on the other side of sort of my regulatory authority and obligations is I think being willing to experiment and being willing to collaborate with industry about, like, if you've got an idea about how cannabis can be more socially available and accessible, bring it on. Because I think it is cuisine. I think it is beverages. I also think there is a place for like a sort of a lounge environment. Because if that's a market that can be viable, allow for it. But also be willing to say, like, this is what it requires, and like, good luck. And like that, sort of back to that example of like, we're going to be the umpire here. When you step into the plate, I hope you succeed. But if you strike out, we're going to call it. And that's like, we should learn from every at bat that we take, though, and sort of hone our game and get better, because that's where, again, the entire industry succeeds. So, look, we're about at the hour or so mark. So I didn't think I'd have enough content to talk with you about anyway, but we seem to fill time, which is nice. A couple other things that we wanted to talk about. Obviously, one segment we'd like to bring pretty routinely is, I don't know, what's the old ESPN show, like Stump the Schwab? Is that what it was?
I remember that show. I used to love that show.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we'd like to do some trivia, where Erik and I, and we'll certainly invite any guests that we have on, bring a question and pose that question to one another. The goal is really to illuminate cannabis policy historically, future, whatever it might be. The goal should not be to stump each other, but instead just test your knowledge. I presume I will stump you often, but we'll see. And then again, we'll see if we can stump one another. But again, the goal here is trivia to bring some levity to the situation, but also, bring some did you know? So, Erik, I'll give you the honors of going first. Just know that I'm a bit of an encyclopedia, so try me.
Well, then this one should be easy for you. Shawn Collins, which was the first state to legalize cannabis via the legislature and not ballot initiative?
So, like, for instance, I couldn't say Massachusetts because they did the ballot question predated the legislative action. Is that just for clarity's sake? So Illinois?
No, good guess. Vermont. And the distinction here, Vermont in 2018, the distinction where this is almost like a trick question. In 2018, they legalized possession and home grow. It wasn't until 2020 where they actually put the regulatory framework around it, but it was their legislature.
Okay.
So there you go. Our nice New England neighbor over here.
Yeah. They have a very, very Vermont program, which I think is one thing that's nice about sort of these state-by-state approaches. There's plenty that is not efficient about that dynamic, but is that you start to see some state personalities sprinkled in as well. And I think Vermont's program is a perfect example of that, where
totally see it. Yep.
Small grows, really home grow central. But I think it fits with the very Vermont dynamic of their marketplace and sort of their consumer base. So, again, plenty to not like about a state-by-state ecosystem, but yeah. Anyway, all right, Erik Gundersen.
What you
got? Which United States president was also a hemp farmer?
George Washington.
Amongst others, yes, I'll give you that one. Yeah,
all right.
Washington. I have some more context too to that one. He grew hemp at Mount Vernon, oddly enough. So, the hemp, just continuing with the theme of hemp, I learned to appreciate just how much of a sponge hemp is and how versatile of a crop it is when one of our former employees, or he's still an employee at the Cannabis Control Commission, so one of my former colleagues told me that we were talking about pesticide drift and sort of the environmental drift that occurs where this plant is a sponge. So anything that's grown outdoors is sort of going to absorb and be brought into the plant. And his way to illustrate that to me was to say, did you know that after Chernobyl, they just planted a bunch of hemp around that scene in that environment to try to get the contaminants out of the air? And
is that true?
I just said it on a podcast, so I assume it's true. Um,
Yeah, we're at our first fact check. We need
if that's a fact check, and if it is a fact check, please remember that the precursor to my statement was someone else told me. So I'm relying, but I think it does speak to how historic the plant is. I mentioned earlier the botanical distinction is very slim between cannabis and hemp. But also when you think about this plant, just keep in mind it is literally a sponge in some ways. And but also again, hemp has a very rich history in this country, so much so that our very first president was a known hemp farmer. So well done. Nice guess. Did you know that, or was that just a guess?
That was a guess, but it made sense, and it turned out to be accurate. So just let the record show, I'm up 1-0 on you.
So the other element to George Washington's history is that the reason we know this is it was in his diaries. And he noted in his diaries separating female plants. So that also, I think, speaks to the known psychoactive elements at the time as well. So again, very rich history. We have a couple options. We can sort of yuck it up some more here, or we can start to put a pin in this entire episode. And in doing so, I think maybe tease a little bit about where we want to go next with this thing. And I don't know. Let's do that, which is what can folks expect moving forward? I think we've given you a bit of a highlight today. I think social consumption was a major theme. We also tried to give you some insights and tidbits about our history as regulators in this space. I think that's the goal moving forward, is sort of a little bit more of this dynamic. We want to bring some folks in, though, because I think at some point you'll get sick of the two of us. I'm already sick of the two of us, so we probably need to bring at least, someone in to break the ice and maybe give us someone else we can pick on. But
yeah, and not just straight up cannabis policy too. There's a lot of really cool things happening in the ancillary space, whether you're talking about technology, product. Not to say that there isn't interesting stuff happening in the policy space, so maybe elected officials, but certainly, just giving a different flavor all the time. And then since it is the hybrid, and we said that we're going to hopefully get some pop culture inserted into the conversation, maybe some more Taylor Swift references, maybe more banter about the Red Sox, Patriots, and Celtics being good New England boys up here. But just keep the conversation going, broaden our view on things, learn some stuff. If anybody has any cool ideas, certainly send them our way, because we'll want to hear it and make sure that we're having conversations that people want to hear.
Well, what I think is really interesting about the spaces that you and I get to work in, the people that we get to work with, is there's really great people in the cannabis industry and around the cannabis industry. To your point, around the cannabis industry, especially around ancillary businesses, there's so many entities that are supporting this industry with I think the embrace of technology is a really great example. And there's so many professional services that are in this space. But it's really, I've always described it as a community, one that has, I think, adopted you and I in different ways of, they've invited us in and taught us so many things about this plant and this culture. And this, I think, is an opportunity for you and I to leverage sort of our industry, I hate to say notoriety, but I think you and I are known quantities in this space as far as our history and the work that we did in our respective programs. But we're still in this space. We're still around this world. And that's a good thing for you and I, of course. But it's also, I think, allowed us to build our networks. We want to leverage that network for this episode, for this program. And I think the pop culture piece especially is where we want to try to bring it home and make it more accessible. We live in pretty dense circles. We talk about regulations all day. We talk about laws all day. But the cannabis industry is not as dense. There's celebrity endorsements and strains and all these things. And, you and I are pretty active on the conference circle, and there's so many different faces and names and interesting characters in this industry that it's unlike any industry I've seen before, I've worked in before. And we want to try to make sure we respect that and its references to pop culture as well. So I probably would lose the Taylor Swift trivia. I might do better in the Patriots, Red Sox, less so the Bruins, because they seem to be selling off. But nonetheless, I think the goal is to try to make this space, this industry, this topic far more accessible, but still take the dents and try to bring it home and sort of breathe some life into it for folks. So that's the concept. We will do our best to succeed. If we don't, we just won't do it anymore. So that's fun too. And you can, I guess, vote with the like and subscribe buttons that you might see somewhere. I don't hear or here, somewhere over here. Definitely read that article that I referenced about a dozen times, because I'll see what the traction is on that. But yeah, again, I think, Erik, thank you for doing this. I've enjoyed getting to know you and this experience as far as our work together. This is just sort of a new approach to it, but thanks for doing this with me. I think it's an exciting idea. And again, the goal is really to just make this entire topic as approachable and accessible as possible. And I think you're a great co-host for this project. So flattered. I think you said it was your idea. Maybe we'll have a trivia question on that at some point. But yeah, any parting thoughts?
Excited for it. First time doing a podcast. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah,
that's what I got.
Wow. I mean, what a way to, how do you follow that? Let's wrap it up. All right, folks. Well, again, thank you for joining us on the first episode of The Hybrid. We will be back with, we assume, at least a few more episodes before we call it quits. But if you have ideas, suggestions, tips, anything at all, please send them in. And we'd be flattered if you would listen again. If you have suggestions for not host, I guess. Well, yeah, if I'm looking for a co-host, suggestions for guests or future topics. If you'd love for me to write about other things, please let me know. I love doing that as well. And we'll see you next time. And again, like I said earlier, hit that like and subscribe, and we'll be back again. Thanks, folks.
See you.
The hybrid. The hybrid. The hybrid.